Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Robert Rotberg on After Timbuktu, putting the Humpty Dumpty of Mali back together again. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, and I'm happy every week to welcome a guest here into the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation to talk about some timely pressing topic in global governance, international public policy. And today I'm very happy to have Robert Rotberg with us, a very distinguished scholar and currently the Fulbright Research Chair in Political Development at the Balsley School and also a Fulbright Visiting Fellow at CG. Welcome, Robert. Good to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
Noted Africa expert, noted expert on failed and failing states, and very much in demand recently as a source of expert commentary on what's been happening in Mali, and hope you can help us shed a little bit of light on that. Mali, I think, is a country that probably most people didn't even know existed until very recently, except that we all grew up with that phrase, Timbuktu, in the back of our minds. Right. And we've heard more about Timbuktu, remarkable set of events in the past several weeks in Mali, and perhaps you can help us understand it. We can start, if it's all right with you, with the French intervention, which seemed to come out of the blue very quickly in the face of a very rapidly evolving situation. What's your understanding of how that came about? What were the moving pieces?
For 8 months, the French, the Algerians, the US, Europe to some extent, had dithered over what to do about the increasing Islamist power in northern Mali, north of the waste in Mali. And Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal, the three key cities. And what the French finally realized after the Islamists made the mistake of crossing the waste and heading to Bamako, 450 kilometers away, that Bamako, the capital of Mali, the Islamists made the mistake of provoking, as it were, the French. The French, realizing that the US and the UK and Europe were not going to act, that the African force which had been forming wasn't going to get there quickly enough, and that the Malian army was hopeless, the French said, we must do something. And they did something. And it's one of the more remarkable interventions in modern times in any of these failed state areas, because the French were enormously successful simply by scaring the dickens out of the militants, bombing, strafing, using helicopters at low levels, and quickly pushing the militants out of the southern part of Mali and into the north and out of the cities. And now they've taken Kidal and they're moving northward toward the Algerian border, pushing the militants back. So what the French did was say, okay, even without the French Foreign Legion, we're okay. And
do you think it was primarily a Malian initiative to ask the French to come
Yes.
help?
Yeah, the president of Mali, the interim president of Mali, in despair at his own military, who he nominally works for because there was a military coup, a march a year ago, called the French president directly, I think, and said, please help.
And what was the French interest in helping?
The French interest in helping was to do something Sarkozy couldn't do, Hollande's predecessor. Secondly, to make sure the 6,000 French nationals in Mali were safe. Thirdly, I think the French were genuinely worried about the rise of Islam in the Sahel, the dry areas south of the Sahara, north of the agricultural areas of Africa. And they felt they were doing a service for world order, and world order is very important. The French usually don't get a lot of credit for strengthening world order, and in many ways this was an attempt to redress the loss of Dien Bien Phu and all sorts of other French losses along the way.
And was it a complicating factor that Mali was a former French colony? Was that?
It should have been a complicating factor, but being asked in by the Malians, it seemed okay. And the critical element, and it hasn't been remarked upon all that much in the press, is that Algeria had to give an okay too, because Algeria usually doesn't want the French around, but in this particular case, Algeria had been fostering Ansar Dine, one of the militant groups, and they had been double-crossed by Ansar Dine, so they were suddenly willing to have Ansar Dine crushed.
Right. So help us understand Ansar Dine and some of the other players in the drama. So my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there was a democratic elected government in Mali that seemed largely well-functioning, but resistance in the north from the Tuareg minority who didn't care for the southern Malian domination, craving for autonomy. Somehow they managed to become captive to an Islamist movement in the north. Is that correct?
Almost. Mali from the 1960s to 1992 was a series of military autocracies, kleptocracies, and so on. Then in 1992, a military officer who had created a coup 4 years previously was actually elected in a fair election. He became president, served from 1992 to 2012. He was ousted by the military, a young military officer group who were very upset that they weren't being given the equipment and the funding to go after the dissidents in the north. So there was a coup in March. The dissidents, the insurgents, the Tuareg mostly, who had come over from Libya with Gaddafi's armed arsenal of arms, had started to liberate northern Mali. There's only one problem. Mali's got 16 million people and there are only 500,000 Tuareg. So the people in the north were Malians, not Tuareg necessarily. They were populated by dark-skinned, Bantu-speaking agriculturalists and city dwellers, and the Tuareg were a minority, admittedly, in Mali, had been discriminated against. So the free movement for the freedom of Azawad, the Tuareg name for northern Mali, was hijacked by first a dissident group Ansar Dine and later a dissident group linked up with Al-Qaeda. And so then we had three groups. We had Group 1, which were the secular Tuareg, Group 2, Ansar Dine, and then a split off from Ansar Dine. Both Groups 2 and 3 linked to Al-Qaeda. And so it got very complicated, got messy, and the French have now restored order and simplification.
Right. Well, we'll talk about the simplification in a moment when we come back with Robert Rotberg. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So let's see if I can better understand the cleavages at work here. So in the south, primarily black, Bantu-speaking. In the north, Tuareg, Arab populations, I assume, in the far north. Religiously, so Muslims largely in the north?
No, everyone's a Muslim.
Everyone's Muslim?
Everyone's a Muslim. The Arabs are really not present in the north except as foreigners.
Right. The Al-Qaeda influence.
Like Americans in Canada, foreigners. And the Tuareg are a minority group. They haven't run anything in northern Mali ever, really, not in the last century. And so you have essentially a Malian government which lost control of, compared to Canada, the Yukon, say. They've lost control of an area to a local group, and the local group actually has no agency because they're a tiny minority of that area. And so they're reclaiming a lost heritage. It's a lost nations issue. But they were armed, well armed with Libyan arms, and so they had actually more firepower than the Malian army, and they had probably better training. Meanwhile, the Malian army had mutinied in Bamako, and they weren't going north unless they were paid well, and no one was paying them well. One more complicating factor, just to make this really very difficult. How were the Al-Qaeda people in the north who later moved in, how were they proposing to pay their way? They were drug smuggling. They were people smuggling. and they were smuggling of all kinds of material goods. So there's a narcotics element in this business across the Sahara also.
So the strict Islamists who were effectively conducting a reign of terror against previous lifestyles in Mali, who were they specifically? And were they indigenous peoples or were they imports?
The Al-Qaeda peoples, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, mostly an Algerian group, linked up and joined up by people who had served in Afghanistan, who might be Nigerians, might be Arabs from the Middle East, might be people from Kazakhstan and so on. This group moved in to the Islamic Maghreb, and the Ansar Dine was formed by a Tuareg who had made friends with a lot of the Al-Qaeda people while being an official Malian ambassador of sorts in Saudi Arabia. He returned. He was a former alcoholic, a former smuggler of some kind. He formed this Al-Qaeda-linked outfit and went from being a secular person to a hardcore Sharia believer. And to bolster his own credibility and the movement's credibility, he imposed harsh punishments on adulterers, thieves, and so on, according to Islamic law. That created a sharp bifurcation between the local people and the outsiders, the insurgents, who were in fact invaders, even though some were local, but most were not.
Right.
So it gets very complicated, and off to one side are the original dissidents, the Tuareg, who had come across from Libya with arms, having served Gaddafi for many years as mercenaries. That group was pushed out by Al-Qaeda and Ansar Dine, and now that group is back in charge in Kidal under some general sort of French oversight, because that's a secular group.
But they had all the weapons from Libya.
They had the weapons in Libya.
Did the Islamists somehow manage to commandeer those?
The Islamists got purchased arms from Algeria, from other places. They did some deals with the Tuareg to get some of those arms. They may have brought in some arms themselves from Libya. Libya's awash with arms at the moment.
Right.
So that's still to be worked out. I mean, no one quite knows who bought whom and so on, and who rented whom. but there were headlines in the world's press. Is this going to be another Afghanistan? No, except it is Afghanistan to the extent that it's a guns bazaar.
Right.
And Islamist bazaar, purchase some ideas and bring them into the local people.
Now, you characterize the move south of the waist on the part of these Islamists as a miscalculation.
Yes, I don't think...
What do you think they were trying to do? What was their objective?
I suspect they saw an opening which would give them the entire country, which would have been an enormous coup. They would have, with the force of arms, simply done a Alexandrian conquest of the South quickly, surgically. And that was their mistake, because that triggered the French response. I'm sure they watched the world and realized that the ECOWAS military force from Africa was not going to get there soon enough. The Malian army wasn't going to be productive, and they doubted the French, the Algerians, the U.S. would do anything. So they chanced it and lost.
And the Algerians?
If the Algerians have effectively closed their southern border, then the militants will eventually be hemmed in and caught, eventually in the next month, say, or so. The Algerians, I think, just like ISI in Pakistan, Afghanistan, were using Ansar Dine as a kind of stalking horse, keeping the Malians alert and generally keeping everything south of their border. Once Ansar Dine behaved in an invading fashion, started toward Bamako. The Algerians were double-crossed, and when and allies of Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda attacked the gas facility, then that was a huge double-cross. And the Algerians want no part of these people anymore, and so they're behind the French. And I gather it was cooperating with French helicopters and Mirage jets and so on.
All right, well, we'll talk about that a bit more when we come back again. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, regional implications. Algeria obviously has learned a lesson, I think, from this whole experience. And the other great display of decisiveness in this episode was the Algerian assault on the insurgents who'd attempted to capture the gas field. Apparently a huge change of heart for Algeria. What does this mean, not just for Algeria, but for other countries in the region who may have tolerated or cut deals with very radical elements and now have before them the example of how this can come back to bite them in the heel?
I think that's right. I think no one wants to play with the forces of evil because, as you say, it might come back and haunt you. I think it's also give greater caution to the people from Niger who have a huge French uranium mine in their country, and who now have French guarding that mine, and who are now willing to have help from the French and oversight from French and U.S. drones to make sure the Tuareg in Niger don't revolt. And don't, because the border of Niger and this part of Mali is very close. The Tuareg roam back and forth. The difference in Niger is they've co-opted many of the Tuareg. There's a prime minister who's a Tuareg. So the Tuareg have agency in Niger in the way they don't have in Mali. But the Tuareg have previously kidnapped people like Bob Fowler, Ambassador Fowler, who was taken near a restaurant in the capital, Niamey, of Niger, which is quite close to Gao and quite close to the Malian border. So we're talking about not huge distances here. And I think this is also a further wake-up call for Nigeria, which has Boko Haram, which is a Al-Qaeda-linked fundamentalist group from the northeast part of Nigeria, and there were reportedly up to 50 Boko Haram training with Ansar Dine in northern Mali. What's happened to them, where they've gone, I don't think anyone knows. But I think this will give greater impetus regionally for ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which is the UN of West Africa, to use greater military force and preventive diplomacy in this region to attempt to extirpate Islamist groups that are causing trouble or possibly causing trouble in this region. Very helpful and clear of any taint so far has been the autocratic government from Ouagadougou. That Burkina Faso. Blaise Compaoré, the president there, has been very useful to the French. There's a French base. The French have operated, run their helicopters out of Ouagadougou, and that's been very useful. So it's this French event has brought together the Francophone area. Right. Yeah.
Meanwhile, Chad has sent troops into Kidal.
That's right. And the report today, which I think is accurate, is that the Chadians are not part of the West African force, but are there to assist the French, to partner with the French. France has a big air base in Chad, and the Chadian troops were essentially brought in as a tough, desert-acquainted fighting force. And I think what France hopes, what President Hollande hopes, is that the Chadian troops will do the chasing of the militants north to Algeria. We think of the Sahara as a desert. It's really lots of hills, some mountains, a few oases. There are places, as Bob Fowler learned, where the militants can hide. They know the desert well, and the Chadians will try to know this desert as well also.
Mm-hmm. What about the implications for Africa as a whole, and the African Union in particular? It seems like a spectacular failure of the security governance aspirations that the African Union had.
Well, that's true, and the African Union has aspirations but has no medal.
And no money.
And no money for sure. But the African Union has condemned, in this case, the coup, and they worked with the West African leaders to try to sort out the coup in Mali. But they have no ability to mount a fighting force, and they're on the sidelines as far as what France has done and what ECOWAS has done. The implications for Africa are this is what should be done, and former colonial powers should be welcomed back if they can help. This is the surprising South African answer. South Africa was very opposed to France helping the AU and UN sanctioned intervention in Cote d'Ivoire in 2011. Now they reversed their line, and they think this is essential that the French did this, and they're much behind it. So that's a change in the leadership views, and we now fortunately have a South African woman who is the Chief Secretary of the African Union, and she will make a big difference.
Very good. We'll be back again in a minute with Robert Rotberg. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So we started off with the problem of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. Are you optimistic about that? And how does one do it? It seems like there's an awful lot of bad blood just at the moment between groups that didn't have an awful lot of good blood to begin with.
It's going to be very difficult, and I'm not quite sure, and I don't think anyone has the exact way to put the army in Mali back into the barracks and then have an election, which the interim president has called for June. But whether he can really run an election without much of an independent election commission, and whether he can enroll voters and have registration and so on before June without massive foreign assistance, I'm not sure. Mali ran itself quite well with fair elections 1992 to 2010, and it ought to be able to do that in theory, but it's got to put the soldiers back into the barracks. And what the soldiers in Mali have long feared, particularly Captain Sanogo, who ran the coup and was responsible, what they feared is that these ECOWAS soldiers would come in and forcibly push them back into the barracks, which would eliminate their power, also eliminate the perquisites that they've added to their lives since March. They've been running a state within a state out of the military barracks about 5K from Bamako, the capital. So how this is going to be done, the interim president appointed by these military people is a technocrat, not really a politician, so he's safe. I mean, he's different from most politicians. I'm mildly optimistic that with some prodding from Nigeria, from Cote d'Ivoire, and from a few other African countries nearby, that the Malian military can be induced or pushed back into the barracks and put the lid back on that particular mutiny, and then Mali can resume its democratic, in quotation marks, its democratic course. I think that's
would the army, though, be worried also now about human rights prosecutions? And lots of reports of human rights abuses on the part of Malian soldiers.
Yes, they should be, but the International Criminal Court, to my knowledge, has not really targeted Mali yet. They should be worried about the ICC. On the other hand, the president of Sudan is still running around free.
Right.
Yes, but I mean, deals will be cut. Deals will be cut to probably give Captain Sanogo and others impunity. We don't like that. It's not good, but that's probably what will happen in order to buy peace in Mali and get things back on track. The bigger issue is, can the Malian army be reconstituted so that it can prevent Islamists next year from resuming a course in northern Mali? I suspect so. I suspect there are elements in the Malian army that are capable of being retrained, although I must say Captain Sanogo was trained by the U.S., and so that's not much of a good mark for the U.S. in this particular lot. But if conceivably there are French troops, not 4,000, but 500 that might be stationed in Mali around the clock for the next year or so.
What will it take to pacify the north and to prevent another sort of Tuareg upheaval?
I think what the Tuareg, the minority Tuareg who asked for the liberation of Azawad, they would like autonomy, and I think it's conceivable that they could be given semi-autonomy, whatever that means. I think we could craft it to figure out some autonomy, give them more power, but since there's such a small minority in this vast region, you can't say, well, you can have a corner of it, because then the majority of the people who are normal Malians wouldn't be treated fairly. But again, that's some clever statesmanship can overcome that, and I think the Tuareg who are secular will be appeased by that, and then the non-secular Tuareg will either be captured or flee into Algeria or go off to join Al-Qaeda some other place.
Now, do you think this whole episode has any interesting implication for the doctrine of responsibility to protect?
Yes, I think it does, because each R2P episode, Libya, Kenya, and now Mali, has had a different twist to it. I think R2P, as invented in Canada and later created as a norm in the United Nations in 2005 and 2009, says that every country in the world has a responsibility to protect people who cannot be protected by their own nation. France has operated very well in this regard. In this particular case, they didn't use the words R2P anywhere, to my knowledge, but we can now claim it as a victory for R2P, and we can say this is what other nations should do in those surgical places where an intervention is relatively easy and where there's no insurgency that's backed by the local people. In this particular case, obviously the local people were being oppressed, so it was simply a question of getting rid of the outsiders, the insurgents who were creating Sharia law for local people who didn't want Sharia law. And I think this has implications for the next crisis that comes along, whether it's Somalia or whether it's Afghanistan and so on.
And is this pouring fuel on the fire of the Huntingtonian clash of civilizations if we all of a sudden classify very strict forms of Sharia rule as inherent violations of R2P?
No, because what I just said a moment ago I think is true, is the local people don't want it, then it's not something that's indigenous, it's not something that is authentic, legitimate is the right word. And in this particular case, it was obvious that the local people were oppressed. In a case, let's say, the Pushtun areas of Afghanistan, possibly it's accepted by the local people, and some even might have wanted the Taliban at one point or might want them back.
Right.
That's at least an open question. But in this area, the agricultural people didn't want a bunch of Sharia spewing nomads ruling over them.
Right. Well, it's a very complicated part of the world, and I'm grateful to you for coming in and helping us understand it a bit better.
My pleasure.
And to the audience, please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
The mistake of crossing the waste and heading to Bamako, 450 kilometers away, that the Bamako, the capital of Mali, the Islamists made the mistake of provoking, as it were, the French. The French, realizing that the US and the UK and Europe were not going to act, that the African force which had been forming wasn't going to get there quickly enough, and that the Malian army was hopeless, the French said, we must do something. And they did something. And it's one of the more remarkable interventions in modern times in any of these failed state areas, because the French were enormously successful simply by scaring the dickens out of the militants, bombing, strafing, using helicopters at low levels, and quickly pushing the militants out of the southern part of Mali and into the north and out of the cities. And now they've taken Kidal and they're moving northward toward the Algerian border, pushing the militants back. So what the French did was say, okay, even without the French Foreign Legion, we're okay.
And do you think it was primarily a Malian initiative to ask the French to come help?
Yes, yeah, the president of Mali, the interim president of Mali, in despair at his own military, who he nominally works for because there was a military coup, a march a year ago, called the French.
International Governance Innovation, to talk about some timely pressing topic in global governance, international public policy. And today I'm very happy to have Robert Rotberg with us, a very distinguished scholar and currently the Fulbright Research Chair in Political Development at the Balsley School, and also a Fulbright Visiting Fellow at CG. Welcome, Robert. Good to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
Noted Africa expert, noted expert on failed and failing states, and very much in demand recently as a source of expert commentary on what's been happening in Mali, and hope you can help us shed a little bit of light on that. Mali, I think, is a country that probably most people didn't even know existed until very recently, except that we all grew up with that phrase, Timbuktu, in the back of our minds. Right. And we've heard more about Timbuktu, remarkable set of events. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Robert Rotberg on After Timbuktu, putting the Humpty Dumpty of Mali back together again. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And I'm happy every week to welcome a guest here into the studios at the Center for in the past several weeks in Mali, and perhaps you can help us understand it. We can start, if it's all right with you, with the French intervention, which seemed to come out of the blue very quickly in the face of a very rapidly evolving situation. What's your understanding of how that came about? What were the moving pieces into the
For 8 months, the French, the Algerians, the US, Europe to some extent, had dithered over what to do about the increasing Islamist power in northern Mali, north of the waste in Mali, and Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal, the three key cities. And what the French finally realized after the Islamists made